Please welcome to the stage Nancy Vigne and members of our Federal Priorities Task Force.
Well, good morning, everybody. We are here today to talk about the very first inaugural task force associated with this council, the Task Force on Federal Priorities. We're going to talk a little bit about the process of developing the recommendations, which I need to say right now are draft, right? These are just getting some ideas on paper that we hope that together over lunch we can dig into more and refine and maybe expand upon as well. But I wanted to describe a bit the process behind developing those recommendations, and then we're going to have a great discussion on some of those recommendations. We won't touch on all of them in this short time this morning, but we can dig into them later. So the task force met on several occasions. We met twice in person. We had lots of subgroup conference calls and lots of drafting and sharing of ideas. But we started very broadly and encouraged ourselves to think boldly, to think outside the box. We used the First Step Act as a frame for that, asking ourselves what could the next steps be, and thinking even beyond what First Step is doing in sentencing to think very broadly about all ways that the federal government can prioritize reform across the criminal justice system. Our development of recommendations was guided by 4 cross-cutting principles. The first was that actions of the federal government need to be grounded in scientific evidence. Our recommendations should be evidence-based, and when they're not, when they're innovative, they should be well-positioned to be rigorously evaluated. Our second principle is around the multiple goals of reentry and really recognizing that reentry policies need to be inclusive and holistic and supportive of everybody who's returning home from prison and making sure that they can contribute to society, thereby reducing recidivism and promoting public safety. We also felt that it was very important for the federal government to prioritize initiatives around identifying and remedying racial and other biases that permeate the criminal justice system. And finally, we felt that the perspectives of victims of crime really need to be front and center in all the priorities that we develop and recommend. So as the video message from Governor Deal indicated, he charged us with thinking big, but he also charged us with thinking pragmatically. He emphasized the goal of developing priorities that were politically viable and also actionable. It's a tall order indeed, and we were very lucky to have a tremendous group of experts that should be appearing on one screen or another, so you can see, yes, my fellow task force members, a really remarkable group of people, a wide array of expertise and experiences and perspectives. And I'm delighted to welcome 3 of my fellow task force members here today. We have Bocanegra, we have Mark Holden, and we have Sally Yates. I don't think any of these people need thorough introductions, and I was advised not to go over their bios, but you should know that they are indeed in the Summit app that you have at your disposal. So what we're going to do today is start talking about these draft recommendations, which again I want to emphasize, it's a beginning. We'll be iterating a lot with these, and talk about where they come from, why we focused on these, and kind of maybe even share a little bit of disagreement among panelists, why we chose this versus that, how we might want to push further and be more ambitious. So the recommendations fall into 4 main buckets. One is on sentencing, one is on violence and trauma reduction, the third is on federal prison reform, and the fourth is on reentry. So starting with sentencing, the sentencing recommendations covered a lot of territory. They included making sure the U.S. Sentencing Commission is fully operational and does its job. They included a very thorough review of the U.S. Criminal Code, of the thousands upon thousands of federal statutes that are no longer useful or may even run counter to the rule of law. But it also includes a pretty bold recommendation about eliminating existing mandatory minimum penalties for drug offenses, as well as instituting a sunset of any new such penalties after 5 years. This is big, and I want to invite Sally to talk first about why this recommendation was developed and how do you think it will have an impact?
Right. Well, first, I would love just to say thank you to all of you for being here today. It's great to see so many old friends and colleagues here. I was not forewarned there would be these enormous screens on either side, though, that would have our faces larger than any woman of a certain age really wants to be. So,
or men, yeah.
Or, yeah. But this is, as we looked at the Federal Priorities Task Force, first, we recognize at the council that the vast majority of people in our criminal justice systems are impacted by the states, not the federal system. But the federal system has a really important role to play, obviously for the people who are within that system, but also to serve as a standard bearer, hopefully, of how things ought to be done. What we've seen, though, most recently is we have been looking to the states as the real innovators in criminal justice reform rather than the feds. But we wanted to try to flip that a bit and to think, if we're thinking creatively, what can we do on the federal side? And you can't really have a meaningful discussion about criminal justice reform without looking at sentencing, and specifically mandatory minimum sentencing in the drug arena. You know, if you go back to the legislative history of when these mandatory minimums were passed, they were really intended to address the drug kingpins who were responsible for bringing in literally tons of illegal drugs into our country. And that's, when Congress passed these laws, that's what they articulated. Those are the people they thought they would be impacting. But if you look over the years since that time, all sorts of other folks have been caught up, and particularly the lower level nonviolent drug offenders who were caught up in this net that really judged sentencing here based primarily on one factor and one factor alone, and that was the weight of the drugs involved. And so as we looked at this, we thought, you know, we know from a data standpoint that this doesn't make sense, that someone serving 20 years in prison instead of 2 is really not making our communities more safe. And so part of the idea of this, of rolling back or eliminating mandatory minimums either for all drug offenses or for certain categories of individuals in that, was also to look at the sunsetting provision primarily for the reason that I just mentioned, and that is when these mandatory minimums are passed, they have a certain objective, but there's nothing in place to really ensure that there is a re-examination to determine whether that objective is being realized through the legislation that's passed. And as we all know, it is hard to get Congress to take a look at criminal justice legislation, and particularly legislation that could be cast as being soft on crime if you were rolling back mandatory minimums. So this would be the forcing mechanism to make them have to look at it.
Makes them have to look back and say, do we want to perpetuate this or not? Good. Mark, another aspect of the sentencing recommendations I know is near and dear to your heart, and that's around state sovereignty on marijuana-based activities.
Yeah.
Can you share more about that?
Yeah. So first off, I'm a big believer in the Bill of Rights, and I like the 10th Amendment, and I think a lot of what the federal government's done in the criminal justice system, we probably should have followed the 10th Amendment and wouldn't have the somewhat of a mess we have today. So that excites me. I don't know anyone else likes the 10th Amendment. I really like the 6th Amendment too. I just want to make a plug for that. We need to, if we don't change any of the laws, what we need to do no matter what is make sure everybody who's in the system gets a full-time lawyer, qualified lawyer, defense lawyer, as is in the 6th Amendment in Gideon. And if we're not going to do that, then I don't understand how any of this is going to work, but I digress. So the whole idea behind the sovereignty is it's a couple of things. One is that, I mean, the war on drugs, I don't want to make anyone mad, but I think that drugs keep winning. And they've been winning for 40-something years now, 50 years. And I think that letting states make these decisions is probably better. Local governments and state governments, I'm not saying it has to be legalized, but they could decriminalize it and let the states make that decision. Mm-hmm. I think that had we done different things in the past with the war on drugs, we might not be in the situation we are now. Who knows? But we talked, the first panel was talking about prohibition and how it doesn't work. But I think letting states make these decisions, and I mean, the reality is you've got 30 plus states now who've either decriminalized it or legalized it. And so if anyone's getting picked up, and I don't think that is the case anymore, but if they are getting picked up for a marijuana possession issue, I mean, it's like getting, back in after Prohibition was over. It just shouldn't happen. Yeah. And, what it will do, hopefully, is keep people out of the system who aren't a threat to public safety, and that's one of the goals, obviously, as well.
And we also talked about the goal of reducing or remedying racial disparity in the criminal justice system. I imagine it would have an impact on that as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first panel went through all that, how these laws are, with all good intent, maybe, or not, whatever, that it impacts people of color, and it impacts poor people. I mean, that's our criminal justice system is really, it's just a poverty trap. Mm-hmm. And so trying to get people away from those things that get them tripped up to begin with is important. And that's just one of the ways to do it, I think. One other thing, we're going to talk about the first step back, and I'll stop talking. I think that what Sally was talking about, and we've been talking about evidence-based practices and science, I think that going back to the mandatory minimum issue, if we believe, and we do now, the first step, we believe that people can get better, right? That they can be rehabilitated. It's about rehabilitation, restoration, and redemption. And if we believe, based on the evidence-based practices and programs, and whether it's education or skills or whatever it is, that people will get better, we shouldn't have to rely on these long sentences. We should be willing to say that, look, this person has now been rehabilitated.
We're going to get to this later.
Okay, I want to make sure.
All right, I promise.
I always eat my ice cream first at dinner, too, man. I just want to get to it.
All right, hold on. That's another topic that we will cover soon. But I want to shift to the second bucket, which is on violence and trauma reduction. And Eddie, I feel like we bonded as fellow task force members over this topic. We sat next to each other at a couple of the meetings and recognized the false dichotomy between victim and perpetrator, and I talked a lot about the role that trauma plays in leading people to engage in violence, and that untreated trauma is so huge and so important. And I think that underlies one of our key recommendations in the violence and trauma reduction category, and that is ensuring that the Crime Victims Fund reaches the people most impacted by violent crime. So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about that.
Sure. So there's a great book by Thomas Abt, Bleeding Out. I believe, given the comments that were shared this morning and right now, that as a country, we need to find ways to heal. And unfortunately, as we know, violence is extremely isolated in specific pockets in our country, particularly in urban communities and so on. And so many of those folks are unable to access resources. So for example, in a program that I'm managing called READI Chicago, just this year alone, we've lost 10 participants to violence. And very few of them, and by very few, I mean 2 or 3 of them, were actually able to tap into resources under the VOCA funds, which is government supported. And the others were unable to tap into it because of current existing laws that prohibit that anybody who is currently on some type of supervision, in this case parole, disqualifies them in many ways. Or they have to go through a process that sometimes becomes very rigorous for many of the families we're working with because of language and so on, that they're unable to access that. So one of the recommendations was we need a federal government to really find ways and solutions to support, whether it's programs or states, to allocate resources where victims could really access these resources. And also, not just the victims, because as you pointed out, this idea that victims and perpetrators are 2 different, kind of groups, in all reality, they're the same group. And this is another reason why, if you think about the Alliance for Safety and Justice, the advocacy that they're doing around that specific population is important. And so one of the recommendations, again, is to figure out a way how the government could support current policies in that area.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we're going to shift a little bit and talk about federal prison reform, and that consists of 2 broad recommendations. One is an area that I feel very strongly about. It recognizes something that I don't think is prominent enough in our conversations. We talk a lot about the importance of what works in preparing people for successful reentry, but rarely is the case that we look at the underlying context of the prison. So think about it. You could have the best, most evidence-based program in the world, but if you are scared, concerned about your personal safety, if you're hungry, if you're perpetually cold or perpetually hot, if you don't have very, very basic medical needs met, how are you bringing your best self to that program opportunity? It's something that we really don't explore a lot, and that's because prisons are such incredibly closed systems. They're closed to research, they don't share their data. There's such a woeful lack of transparency and accountability. So one of the recommendations we came up with is to have much more oversight of the federal prison system. There's some examples from the state that could be replicated at the federal level, but if the federal level, if that leadership happens, that could also spur the same kind of accountability across the country. So I'd invite any panelists to respond to that one, and then I'll talk about the other big federal prison reform recommendation.
Well, I think it's a good idea. I think oversight in any situation, but particularly where you're locking up humans and making sure that the conditions for the staff, which is very important, and for the people who are incarcerated, that we're doing it right and getting it right. And I have a lot of respect for people who work in prisons. I worked in one a long time ago when I was younger, and it's a really tough job. I think, though, at the federal level, and I've said this to people from DOJ and the Bureau of Prisons, I do think that there needs to be a culture shift, in my opinion, for what it's worth. And I just think the name alone, we talked about messaging early in the first panel today about how we talk about people, ex-cons or formerly incarcerated or whatever. And, I worked at the Worcester County House of Correction. It was 1981, 82, I worked there. And we had the messaging right about corrections. There wasn't a whole lot of corrections going on, but we had that right. But, the Bureau of Prisons is still the Bureau of Prisons. And I think that given the way other states now call it, either corrections or rehabilitation, their name should change. I really do. It sounds maybe kind of dorky or silly, but it matters. And I think that they should be the Bureau of Rehabilitation and Corrections. And I think that having oversight is important. I know DOJ is oversight. It has the authority over BOP. I'd probably shift it or get it at least under places like HHS and the Department of Labor. If we're talking about programs, we're talking about people getting better. And they know how to do that. With no offense to anyone in DOJ, that's really not what they're good at. It's not their comparative advantage. So I think this is important. And I'm excited, as you said, we got all these new programs coming in, the evidence-based programs. We're going to have to fund them. We're going to have oversight. We've got to make sure they work because there's a lot riding on this.
Thank you. So the second item is around correctional education. It involves several provisions, including incentivizing the participation in education in federal prisons in the same manner that substance abuse treatment is currently incentivized in the system. Sally, you've been very outspoken on the importance of education. I'm wondering if you can share more about this recommendation.
Well, I think if we're truly serious about building safer communities, then no one would leave the Bureau of Prisons without having engaged in a meaningful education program. And right now, that just simply doesn't exist within BOP. It's not really an incentivization issue here. There are tens of thousands of inmates in the Bureau of Prisons on a waiting list just to be able to participate in a GED prep program, which is the only education program that is offered across the board at the Bureau of Prisons. Again, we know what the data is, that individuals are 2/3 less likely to reoffend if they engage in education programs while they are in prison. And so it makes complete sense from a public safety standpoint. It also makes sense from just a humanitarian standpoint, that here we have an opportunity with individuals who are spending years in prison. How can we not be giving them that opportunity to better themselves and to be better equipped to be able to be contributing members of society when they are released? But we're going to have to provide the funding for that.
Absolutely.
Because right now it simply isn't there. Even under the First Step Act, it's not there to do what needs to be done across the board at BOP.
Yeah. Eddie, you have personal experience with education behind bars. Can you share a bit?
Yeah, and it wasn't me teaching anybody in there. We know, many of us in this room probably have heard the ACEs study, and we know about brain development and so on. And so there was no surprise that the first time that I witnessed a homicide was 13, and then the following year, joining a street gang. And then by the time I was 18, I was in front of a judge being sentenced to 29 years, to which I served a little bit over 14 years. And people always expect, like, how did you get this to be where you're at right now? What was the directory like? And the truth is, it wasn't just one single thing, but one thing that I would attribute a lot to my success at this point in my career was the level of education that was provided for me while I was in the state of Illinois Department of Corrections. And what do I mean by that? That at the time, there was a program that was supporting students or inmates there, however you want to frame that. And so I was able to get my GED. I was able to benefit from some of the associate degrees that were offered there for community colleges. And some of the vocational trainings. Back in 99, 98, the program was removed, and much of the education that was being provided in the state of Illinois was taken away. And that became a challenge for many people. And ultimately is that, as Sally was pointing out, if we want people to come out of prison better than when they came in, we have to understand that all the science in the world is telling us that most of our prisons are young people who've been impacted by trauma. And so we have to address that, but we also have to educate, because we know that by educating, we're also providing a way where they are more hopeful for a better future. And ultimately, the question is for our community. Do you want somebody less educated to be your neighbor coming out of prison, or somebody who's more educated, who ideally, with advocacy, there's more doors that could be opened through employment and so on. So I'm a firm believer of that, and if it wasn't for that, I would never have received my master's at the University of Chicago.
You might not be sitting here today.
True.
Well done. Thank you. I'm going to shift focus a little bit. This is the reentry category, although arguably education counts for reentry as well, so we might want to reconsider how we organize these recommendations. But the reentry category has several recommendations, and one, which arguably could also be the sentencing category, was something you were trying to talk about earlier, Mark, which is the egregiously long sentences that are served across the country, but particularly in the federal system. So one provision that I'm very fond of is the second look provision. Basically, the idea is that people, after serving at least 15 years, people, I mean, this is already an incredibly long time. After serving 15 years, they would be eligible to petition the court for a re-examination of their sentence, right? I love this recommendation because it recognizes both the research, the science behind what we know about people who age out of criminal activity, but it also recognizes that the power and importance and truth of redemption, right? People can transform themselves, they can change. So this is certainly an important provision, and one that we'd like to see move forward. And I would ask you, Mark, to share a little bit, and then maybe Sally as well.
I think it makes sense. I think that there are people who need longer sentences in our system, state and federal, but most people don't. I think that I learned or heard a long time ago that most things are less expensive than prison and more effective than prison. And so I think that giving ourselves a second chance, a second look, is important. Again, that goes back to what I was saying with the evidence-based practices, that people are going to get educated, they're going to get skilled, they're going to get de-traumatized, hopefully if it's funded and implemented and all that. And if that's the case, we're not getting the bang for that buck, we're wasting human potential if we don't give them a second chance and we just say, sorry, you got another 20 years.
Yeah.
I think we really, as a country, and this, both sides did it, we were all involved, it was all on us. We need to look at what we've done, and we need to have, the reforms that have been made the last 10 to 15 years, it's phenomenal, it's great. Everything you get, you want more and more and more. But it isn't at the same rate of change that happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, which created all these issues. We've got to, again, consistent with public safety, but based on the science, we need to move quicker and more forcefully to get this done, because it will save lives, save communities, save money. It's good stuff.
Sally, thank you.
And I would agree with Mark. I think that there are some very dangerous people out there who need to be in prison for a very long time. But that's a really small group of people. And I know from having reviewed scores and scores of clemency petitions during the Obama administration, there are people in prison who have truly turned their lives around. I think the issue with this recommendation is the fact the devil's going to be in the details here.
Yes.
In terms of what the mechanism is that we would recommend and that could practically be implemented for such a second look, whether it's with an original sentencing judge, a judge that's identified within each district,
Sure.
whether it's essentially bringing parole back to the federal system, which Congress made a big deal of eliminating. I think the devil is in the details.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about going before the original sentencing judge after 15, maybe more years, likely they're not even on the
Right.
bench anymore. So
Oh, I know
there's a
some
lot-
of them who still
There's
are.
a
so-
lot. There's a lot to be sorted through here. Shifting focus a little bit, another provision is clean slate at the federal level. And I'm wondering if we might start with you, Eddie, and share a little bit how clean slate might have affected your reentry.
Well, listen, I know, I recognize that at the federal level there is no parole system, and I recognize that every state has different policies and parole process and so on. Some people are indefinite on parole. Even after they finish doing 20 years in prison, for the rest of their life, they have to be on parole. And I think about the barriers that creates for people. I strongly believe that because of my release and because of the supports that I had and the education that I had, I have been able to capitalize off the opportunities that have been fostered to me. But there are so many people who don't have the same level of access that I did, right? There's so many people who don't have the same level of support. And so, a recommendation like this, for a lot of people like myself, could benefit in multiple ways. And I can't help but to think about, what is our return of investment when you incarcerate somebody for regardless how many years and they come back home and there is no way to really receive them into the community and think about a really structured way to support an individual where they could be more successful. So I think that this particular recommendation will help create some of that space.
Yeah, and another recommendation is around the behavioral health needs of people returning home, which we know are considerable. And so we have some recommendations around access to medication-assisted treatment behind bars, as well as ensuring that people can get on Medicaid, so get them all set up to get enrolled so that they have supports for a continuum of care on the outside. I'm wondering if anyone has anything to add to that recommendation.
Clean slate, or which one? Either?
Whatever you want to talk about.
Well, I think, I'm just talking about clean slate. I think that mental health is very important, and that we need to get people set up for success, both in and out of prison, for sure. But the clean slate is exciting. It's passed in 2 states now, in Pennsylvania, and it's been implemented. And I think it's being implemented in Utah. Michigan looks like it's going to do it. North Carolina should have done it 6 months ago, but hopefully that gets done. And again, that is really good stuff. It's just basically gives people, it's the whole idea of collateral consequences and being reminded every single day of your life of the worst thing you ever did. And, there are some people that maybe need to have that with them forever, I don't know. But a lot of people don't, and it keeps them from being able to fully participate in, our society. And it's really a stain on us, because I always understood that when you paid your debt to society, you should get your rights back.
Yeah.
Now, there'll be reasons not to, but we never forgive the debt a lot of times. So these are good programs. There needs to be more. And again, for me, it needs to go at a much faster rate and hitting a lot more crimes than it is right now. But we'll take it and keep moving. We're going to show that it makes people safer, makes communities better, and then we'll be able to keep driving more and more reforms, hopefully. That's the goal.
Terrific. Anyone want to add on the other topic?
Well, I wanted to just add to what Mark said. Like, as a country, right, society, we have all these programs for debt forgiveness for students and so on, right, mortgages and all that. But for returning citizens, right, for this particular population, that doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
So I can't, in my personal faith, I think about Luke 17:11, and I can't help that, at that moment in the story, there's 10 individuals with leprosy. Christ heals one of them. He comes back, gives thanks. For me, every day that I wake up, I aspire to be like that person, because having a criminal background, no matter how much good I've done, no matter how much acclimates, no matter how big my family is and where I live, I will continue to be stigmatized because of that mistake that I did at 18. And without even people recognizing what led me to that mistake and what caused that. And it wasn't for purse snatching or stealing a car. It was a violent act. And so I think about, how can we, and this goes back to the earlier comment about there is power in the stories that you tell, And there's power in the words that you choose to tell or to use to tell these stories. And I think it's important to remind ourselves about that, because otherwise we continue to stigmatize individuals or marginalize people, generally speaking. And we put people into these buckets all the time, all the time.
Labels.
Minor offenses, violent offenses. And I get it. I understand that there needs to be some type of order and accountability and all that. But there has to be a better way of managing the current situation that we're in right now.
Thank you, Eddie. Look, I knew we didn't have a lot of time to discuss these recommendations. This is really the tip of the iceberg. I hope it has whet your appetite, and I choose those words carefully because we will be discussing these over lunch in a few short minutes. So I invite you to think about what you've heard today, what you like, what you disagree with, where you think we might go further. You'll be assigned to tables to discuss various topics, and we look forward to hearing from all of you. But for now, please join me in thanking our panelists.
Yeah,